White supremacy has been on a tear trying to rewrite the history books. A few years back, a so-called history pamphlet out of Virginia was trying to teach elementary school kids that the African slaves lived lives of quiet dignity. That phrase, lives of quiet dignity, is used more than any other to mischaracterize the endless suffering Africans endured during slavery. The point of this white supremacist propaganda is to miseducate children, particularly black children, teach them a false version of slavery before they even know what slavery is. This is a form of mind control, and you better learn to recognize it when you see it. One recent children's book that attributes quiet dignity to slavery is Dave the Potter, a book about a black man forced into slavery, but don't worry, he's one of those happy slaves who loses himself in his work because black folks just loves toiling for massa, don't you know? Needless to say, the white reviews of this book give it thumbs up precisely because it, quote, refuses to scrutinize life as a slave. To them, that's one of the book's good points. Now that is what you call sanitizing history. White people who are confronted on their whitewashing of history always try that feeble line about children should learn history. But the problem is this isn't history at all. It's white supremacist propaganda that tries to get away with convincing the reader that being a forced prisoner, beaten, degraded, and stripped of all dignity and hope is a small thing, a trivial matter when compared to the grand enterprise of making pots for your slave master. You are hearing it from the white people themselves. Being a slave, that's a minor point, not even really worth mentioning. What's really important is that you keep working for massa. And these are the people making the books that you let your children read. Another so-called geography book called African slaves workers, as if they'd volunteered to be beaten, raped, and murdered in the concentration camps of the American South. And now we have a new work of white rewriting of history called A Birthday Cake for George Washington. Talk about sympathy for the devil. Before we go any farther, it's way past time the white supremacist demagogues and lunatics of yesteryear were consigned to the trash bin of history. Animals like Cecil Rhodes, the Butcher of Africa, George Washington, the Adolf Hitler of American history, and Thomas Jefferson, the Pol Pot of the Western Hemisphere, must all be erased. Some white people have tried to salvage the monuments to these monsters by claiming it's wrong to remove them because they're a legitimate part of history. Well, that's the reason we have history books, stupid. We can recount Washington's demonic crimes there, but when it comes to the society, the places of government, education, and culture, you do not allow them to be monuments to monsters. Adolf Hitler's statues were not allowed to remain standing. Neither were Joseph Stalin's or Saddam Hussein's, and these men didn't kill anywhere near the number of people Washington did. This so-called book is about an African named Hercules who had been forced into slavery on George Washington's plantation of Mount Vernon. This book actually tries to characterize the satanic institution of slavery as nothing more than happy-go-lucky feel-good material for little kids. Apparently, it's the dictator's birthday, and the happy slaves have a huge problem. They've run out of sugar. Perhaps they could have run down to the plantations in Georgia and Louisiana to get it, though they would have been tripping over the dead bodies of the Africans who had been worked to death in the process. Alas, that's not how the story goes. Instead, what we get are the slaves racking their innocent little brains to think up ingenious solutions to this huge problem. This is not a revision of history, or even a rewriting of it. It is a flat-out pack of lies. And that's the point of the story. If white people are inconvenienced in any way, black people are supposed to worry themselves to death over it. Making sure white people are perfectly happy at all times is supposed to be our top priority. Now, the author of this so-called book is Ramin Ganeshram. She's half Trinidadian, half Iranian, and all stupid. You can guess what the white publishing media said about her book. They praised it to high heaven, calling it so well researched. Even Scholastic Publishing, who printed this trash, heaped unequivocal praise on her, at least until the backlash started. The editor of Scholastic Publishing tried to defend this tripe by asserting that Washington admired the slave Hercules. Sure, admired him so much that he declared all black people to be subhuman. This woman even went so far as to say that the slaves took great pride in their ability to cook for a man of such stature. That's right, white people always asserting that the slaves took pride in serving white people. It never occurred to this twisted degenerate that the slaves hated Washington, as all slaves hate slave masters, and only cooked for the bastard for the same reason a slave does anything, because they have no other choice. This is the world through whitey vision. At this point, I think it best to mention that that editor, Andrea Davis Pinckney, is a black woman. I hope now you're starting to understand how the machine of enslaving black children's minds works. White supremacy always has a few black crash dummies out front, and she's not the last black female who we'll find in this cesspool. See, that's how white supremacy works. It keeps up a constant, never-ending drumbeat against justice. It is constantly trying to see what it can sneak under the door and what it can get away with. Then, when they're caught, they try to play innocent, as if none of the editors or readers or publicists for this book had actually read it. Once people found out about it, the backlash was sudden and fierce, as it should have been. But Ganishram, wanting to earn her white benefactor's favor, refused to admit to what she'd done. In her own half-assed defense of the pack of lies she told, she said, "How could they smile? How could they be anything but unrelentingly miserable?" How indeed? Especially considering that Hercules himself escaped from Mount Vernon, a fact conveniently omitted from the body of the book. And would you like to guess on what day Hercules chose to run away from Mount Vernon? It was on George Washington's birthday in 1797. How surprising that Miss Ganishram chose to leave that out of her story. Ganishram tried to cover her worthless hide by adding a tacked-on note at the end of the book, clearly an afterthought, where she gave a couple of the horrifying facts of what life in George Washington's satanic clutches was actually like. But then she gets to the point she really wanted to make, and it's straight out of every white supremacist justification of slavery you ever heard. There were some enslaved people who had a better quality of life than others and close relationships with those who enslaved them, but they were smart enough to use those advantages to improve their lives. The same old lie of where they give some minor lip service to how this is really about African dignity, but at the same time always maintaining white supremacy. And as for that better quality of life business, yep, the old thank God for slavery 'cause it freed you darkies from savage Africa lie. Meanwhile, at this same time in history, the whites were flooding into that exact same savage Africa from all corners. And the close relationships with their enslavers is more beneficent white master talk, a cute code phrase meant to cover up rape, the selling of black children, and the brutalization of black people on a massive scale. Now you understand why movies like The Blind Side and The Help are so popular with white people. They've created an entire fantasy world in their own minds, where all they ever did was help people, when, as Malcolm correctly observed, there is nowhere on this planet they can go and claim they brought peace or made things better. And I also want to note the illustrator of this book is a woman of color, though you couldn't tell by looking, Vanessa Brantley Newton. And like so many black women, even though it's pig simple obvious she's black, when describing herself, she goes out of her way to downplay that. She described herself as coming from a blended background, African American, Asian, European, and Jewish. All of you swirler intersectionalists, this is the kind of confused offspring you create, because color blindness means nothing in a world where power only recognizes color. This woman is taking part in justifying the brutality against African people, but she doesn't see herself as African at all, so it doesn't bother her. She identifies with everything but Africa. She gleefully promotes the lie that only happy slaves toiled in Washington's concentration camp. And don't go thinking having a sorta black woman be the illustrator was some sort of coincidence. When white supremacy is looking to launch a big attack on Africans, they have always made a point to get a few dark faces out front to sell it. Her job was to try to help them deflect the accusation of blatant racism, which she attempted to do. Of course, Ganishram and her ilk will try to pull the old Washington was a man of his time card, and that he didn't truly know what he was doing was wrong. Well, if that's true, then why didn't he put his own white wife and white children out in those killing fields? Why wasn't he out there himself? Why didn't he write laws saying that all people were only 3/5 human? And as for Ganishram, she's the child of immigrants, needless to say, and she knows the game she has to play to gain white acceptance, and she's playing it. Black people better start realizing we have no friends. Now there is an end note I want to put on this. This is the reason why it's so important that we create our own media for our own people and support it aggressively, because black empowerment starts in the womb. You teach black children to respect themselves or to hate themselves from the cradle. I've often said that if black women demanded black men produce a children's book before they would be allowed to sleep with them, we'd have black men lined up around the block, manuscripts in hand. Instead, the emphasis is on a black man having swag and mixtapes. So all we have are black men lined up around the block trying to get people to listen to their demo. This must stop. Black children are in a war, and the principal battleground is their minds. When you refuse to create or support content for black children, you are surrendering the battlefield to theGanishrams and Newtons of this world. And they are making it clear their mission is to teach your black children to be happy, smiling servants of white supremacy.